Why participate? Democracy depends on voters having the opportunity to choose their representatives. The U.S. Constitution requires that every American receive as close to equal representation as possible in government. As populations of districts change over time, it can leave some people overrepresented and others underrepresented in government. Redistricting evens out the population between districts. Census results are used to draw new maps every 10 years to account for the ways that populations have changed and moved across the states and districts. How the district boundaries are configured can make the difference between empowering and maximizing the voters' voices or minimizing and muting those voices. When elected officials redraw the lines of their own districts, they get to choose who their voters are, potentially without regard to the communities, neighborhoods, shared interests, or commonalities of those areas. Prior to 2010, legislators in California drew the lines. The creation of the Citizens Redistricting Commission was intended to allow every Californian to have a voice in the process of drawing new district lines. We can get some of the information we need from California's counties and cities, but we need Californians to tell us about their neighborhoods and communities of interest. We need all Californians to get involved so we have a better idea of the communities of interest throughout California when we redraw the district lines. For more information on redistricting, please visit our website at wedrawthelinesca.org.
Hi, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christian Arana, and I'm the Vice President of Policy at the Latino Community Foundation. We are California's sole philanthropic organization whose mission is to unleash the civic and economic power of Latinos in the state. And so I want to welcome everyone today who's viewing this online to Latinos Draw California, Redistricting, and the Path to the 2022 Midterms. At the Latino Community Foundation, we know that the Latino community and their civic engagement is essential to the strength of our democracy. It is why for over a decade now, we've made investments in Latino civic engagement a focal point of our philanthropic and advocacy work. In 2020, we launched a historic statewide campaign to count Latinos in the state to ensure our rightful share to political power and resources for our communities, resources for housing, for schools, for our healthcare. And what the census results showed was actually something really remarkable. I think despite all these doomsday headlines that we saw about California losing a congressional seat, California's population did grow, and Latinos were responsible for over 2/3 of the state's growth over the last decade. And so how we channel that growth is what actually brings us to this day and to this conversation. Because following the census, we all have an opportunity to participate in a process known as redistricting. And you'll hear more about this from the panelists, but just a very brief description for now. It's a process where we redraw the lines for all the political seats in the state. So from congressional seats all the way down to city council seats, in order to make sure that these new lines reflect the changing demographics of our community. And so for the 2021 redistricting process, the Latino Community Foundation has invested in grassroots organizations that are educating their constituencies on this important process. We've mobilized our network of Latino philanthropists to also participate. And we've engaged with other partners to help them understand why this process matters for the Latino community's political power in the state of California. And over the course of the next 5 years, we're going to continue to seek to build power in the Latino community. Earlier this year, we launched the Latino Power Fund because we know that once these seats are redrawn, we have to make sure that whatever elected officials and the policies that they put forth, that they actually reflect the needs of our community. And so before we kick it off to a phenomenal panel led by Samia Kamal from Cal Matters, who has been covering this issue for a very long time now, in this panel, she'll help us explore more about the Latino community's need to participate in redistricting and how it might affect next year's midterms. So before we do all that, we first want to acknowledge that as we undertake the remaining months in this year to essentially slice and dice the state into political districts, it's important to remember that we're all sitting on land that belongs to Indigenous communities. And to help bring them into this space, I want to invite Victor Espinosa from one of our community partners, Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, otherwise known as MICOP, They're based in Ventura County, who will help us begin this really important conversation by helping us acknowledge our Indigenous communities. So Victor, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you to the Latino Community Foundation for this initiative and for our previous partnership, and greetings to all of the panelists and all of our audience. My name is Victor Espinosa. I'm the Director of Behavioral Wellness at the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project. We were founded in 2001 in the city of Oxnard, California, and we now do work all along the Central Coast in Oxnard, Santa Maria, and San Luis Obispo. We represent thousands of Indigenous migrant communities from Mexico who are largely farm workers and who contribute immensely to California's agricultural and overall economy. As such, just wanted to acknowledge where I'm coming from this afternoon. Where I live in Ventura County is traditional Chumash land, and that goes for also Santa Barbara County and all along the Central Coast. The Chumash people, many of them have Latino and Spanish surnames today because of the mission system that was imposed on them in California. And so as Latino people, we want to acknowledge the complex and conflicted history that we all embody. And also, as we move into this redistricting process, we also want to acknowledge where we are with the climate and the fact that Indigenous people and their traditional ecological knowledge for thousands of years has helped to maintain this climate in balance. And so whoever becomes our new district representatives and whoever is chosen to be able to provide equal representation to us, we want to recognize that the Indigenous people of this land need to be consulted first and foremost about any decisions that have to do with how their lands are used. In addition to that, I also want to acknowledge the many unrecognized tribes who also sit within this land, and those who will never be recognized by the federal government, but who continue to retain their traditional language, ways of life, and cultural practices. And with that, I think I will pass it over. And again, thank you so much for this invitation, and best of luck with all of our redistricting. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Victor. Yeah, for that and for all the work that you do at MyCop. So next, we're going to turn it over to our panel. I think we are having technical difficulties with getting Dolores back on, but I think we'll begin the conversation and as she comes back on. But I want to introduce Samia Kamal, a reporter from Cal Matters, who's been covering redistricting for quite a while now. If you haven't read any of her stories, I highly encourage you to please read, to share, to tag her on Twitter, because all the work that she's done has just been incredible to make sure that we are all aware about what's at stake and how this process known as redistricting is affecting all of us. So I'll kick it over to you, Samia, to kick it off with this panel.
Great. Thank you for the kind words, Christian. I appreciate it. So as Christian mentioned, my name is Samia Kamal. I'm a reporter for Cal Matters, which is a newsroom focused on explaining California politics and policy. And what better topic to dive into than redistricting to explain, because it can feel like a murky one, but I think we've had some that video and a good explanation from Christian. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today. We're going to be talking to our panelists about what redistricting means for all of us in our lives and what our role is in this process. And since we want to make sure we have time for some audience questions at the end, let's go ahead and get right into it. So a quick introduction to our panelists. We have with us Dolores Huerta, a leader of the labor rights movement who has fought to make sure workers are treated fairly. In addition to her decades of work doing that, she has fought against systemic racism, and now through the Dolores Huerta Foundation works to empower communities through grassroots movements and engagement. We also have with us Sunny Wakneen, an attorney with the UCLA Voting Rights Project and part of its Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, where her work focuses on making sure that everyone has a fair chance to vote and have their vote heard. We also have with us Eli Flores, Executive Director of the Orange County Communities Organized for Responsible Development, which is a community labor alliance that helps provide the research and tools communities need to be able to advocate for their needs. So as we saw from the video, or for those just joining us, redistricting is about redrawing local, statewide, some national district maps to, in response to how populations change. And that impacts who you vote with and who represents you. So for my first question to our panelists, if you could talk about why redistricting matters and how it impacts the work that you do. And if we could start with Dolores.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, thank you. And I want to thank all the other panelists. Well, first of all, we know that the people that are elected and to the various positions, whether it be the water board, the school board, the city council, board of supervisors, the state legislature, the Congress, they are the people that decide where resources are going to be allocated, where the money is going to be spent. And I can give you one good example here in Kern County, where we have the majority of the members of our board of supervisors are Republican, a white male. We have one Latina, a Democrat on the board of supervisors. And when it came to allocating the resources for COVID relief, our organization, along with we formed a coalition of organizations to be able to access some of the COVID money so we could do outreach in the communities, which we are doing anyway, but we wanted to get some of this funding that's coming down from the federal and the state government. Well, the Board of Supervisors voted not to give it to our coalition, which are primarily a coalition of communities of color, and instead gave it to the Chamber of Commerce. Okay, and that is just an indication because it turns out that one of our coalition members had issued a statement about defunding the police. Okay, but it was a straight because most of the people that have been affected, as you know, by COVID in our Latino communities and our farmer communities. Another really good example of this is with our school board here in Kern County. We were able to take care of this issue, by the way, but they had four of the five trustees of the school board lived within 5 miles of each other, all in the richest part of Kern County. And yet the 70% of the students in the school district, in the high school district, were kids of color, but, minority children. We were able to, threaten a lawsuit against them, so they had to redraw those districts. And we were able then to change the complexion of the trustees on the school board, where we now have 2 Latinos, 2 women who were ex-teachers, whereas before it was mostly all Anglo, again, white men with very racist tendencies, I might say. So another really big example is we passed a big water bill here in our state of California a couple of years ago. And but the water districts, who, by the way, are also elected positions, you have many people on those water districts, the current water districts, that are not carrying out the mandates of this big state water bill that we passed. So it is of crucial importance for representation, for the allocation of resources. And right now, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, we have several people that we have been working on redistricting, but unfortunately, the Board of Supervisors in Fresno County, the Board of Supervisors in Kern County, again, this is the Central Valley of California, have already voted to adopt their maps, not the maps that the coalition that we have presented, which would be more fair to communities of color. So down the line, we'll probably have to file a bunch of lawsuits like we did before to make them do the right thing, and have the judges then take it back down there to them and tell them that they have to do fair maps. If not, the judges will draw the maps for them. And even on our state commission that we have right now, as it was explained, that we have a state commission that draws a map. We do not have representation of people of color on that commission. So we don't know what's going to be happening. We're going to know in the next couple of months of what the maps look like. But the maps are being voted on right now as we speak. The maps are being decided on what those electoral districts are going to look. So while we might say, well, maybe it's not as bad as it is in the South, I can tell you in the Central Valley of California, it's not looking very good for us right now, because the commission does not have the representation on the commission that it should have. Sorry, that was a long statement.
No, that's okay. And I think that that covered a lot of what redistricting involves: education and water and all of these issues. Sunny, if you could talk about, why redistricting matters to you and how it impacts your work at the Voting Rights Project.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think redistricting should matter to everyone. It matters to me because we talk about representation. I think we talk about, the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. And the right to vote really implicates the policy decisions that we make. It makes a difference in everything that we do. And so if we have elected officials who are not just, who are voted into office based off of unequitable, unfair, or possibly district lines that violate the Federal Voting Rights Act, U.S. Constitution, and California Constitution, then we're not really having fair elections. I don't think that could be said. So the work that we do at the Voting Rights Project is, I would say, lovingly informing counties in California and Washington and Texas and all over the country of the importance of following the Voting Rights Act. And what I mean by that is, specifically in the Voting Rights Act, there is a provision that requires protected class communities, so that includes Latino communities, of having an equal opportunity or the ability to elect candidates of choice. And so when we talk about redistricting, that really directly affects a community's ability to elect a candidate of choice if you're getting what we call cracked, split apart from one another in your community, packed. So you're basically vote sinking a community, or if you're retrogressing, which means that there's a district that has elected, and this, for example, a Latino candidate of choice for the past few years, and the new map removes the Latino community, portions of the Latino community from that map, so that way it won't continue to elect a candidate of choice once that map is adopted. So a lot of the work that we're doing is really focused on that. For example, we've been really active in Orange County, making sure that there's a Latino majority district there as required by the Federal Voting Rights Act. So, it's important because we want to make sure that the policies that people are voting on and the elected officials that we're voting into office are truly representative of the communities and haven't been elected into office because they've gotten to draw their own lines and pick their voters or disenfranchise other people that might disagree with them.
Yeah, and that helps. I think we hear the term gerrymandering a lot, and that goes back to what Sunny was saying, these two methods of gerrymandering, which are packing or cracking, like different ways that the lines can be drawn to disempower communities. And speaking of Orange County, Ellie, could you talk about why redistricting matters to you? And if I can throw you a curveball a little bit, could you talk about how this year is different, or under the independent commission, things have been different, and what opportunities are there for community involvement?
Sure, sure. So I'll share again. My name is Eli Flores, Executive Director over at Accord, and thank you so much, Latino Community Foundation. Thank you for you all for being on the panel, and it's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be also on the panel with Ms. Dolores Huerta. And so I'll share briefly a little bit of my personal story of why I think not just redistricting but representation in general is important to me. You know, I am a formerly incarcerated young person, and I remember one day being in East Lake Juvenile Hall and feeling, you know, angry, worthlessness, and due to the mistreatment that was going on in there and what I was seeing. And I remember telling myself that if I could ever do anything to change what happens in here, I would, right? And at the age of 17, I received an opportunity to become a youth organizer with the Youth Justice Coalition. And my work essentially was to challenge the mass incarceration of youth of color. And so I say that because at the time in juvenile hall, I did not understand what I was feeling. But I later realized that it was a feeling of being voiceless. It was a feeling of not fully being represented and the issues and the needs that we had in there. And to be able to even just talk about the conditions, right, and be able to change that. And so I think this is why I think the work that includes redistricting is so important, right? Redistricting is really about power and representation, and is the ability to dictate the future of our communities. So, you know, next to the 2020 census, you know, where there is a distribution of billions of dollars, right, and also congressional representation, you know, the redistricting changes the political lines, right? It changes who has power in the community, and will the power be given to the Latino voters, or will the power be given to other folks in the community, other political powers in the community, if you will. So it's really about giving voice many times to the voices. And in Orange County, to sort of share about your question of how does this implicate, or how is it different this time around? I think one, because Orange County is I think one of the fastest, along with the Inland Empire, one of the fastest growing Latino communities in the state. And so there's a lot of implications, right, in Orange County. I think that when it comes to not just the California Redistricting Commission, all right, I came back. I think I don't know where I left off, but I was wanted to quickly just briefly talk about Orange County. I was mentioning that Orange County is one of the biggest and fastest growing Latino communities, along with the Inland Empire. And so I just wanted to share that because of that, if we do not fight for Latino districts in Orange County, I think we miss a major opportunity to have representation for Latinos in the county. And so we're seeing this not just at the state level in the commission, but we're also seeing it at the local level when the counties are rolling out their maps, when the cities are rolling out their maps. We are seeing that there has not been full engagement of the Latino communities at these local levels. And a lot of the electeds that are up for election next year want to many times speed this process along. And so it is our job as nonprofits to put the brakes on these processes and ensure that Latinos are represented. And so I think this is this year, because of COVID and because everything is being done digitally, I think it has created I think it's both a challenge, but an opportunity, because more people can now engage online and over the phone. So we have seen that both as a challenge, but an opportunity this time around to engage more people. And then we've been able to push to ensure that folks have language accessibility when trying to be part of these processes as well. So I think that's been both a challenge and an opportunity that we've seen now in Orange County.
Great, thank you for that. And I apologize, I have some background noise, but to get into our next question, if we could start, we'll go in the same order so you guys have a little bit of a break between your responses. But if you could talk about the challenges facing the Latino community right now and how redistricting could address those challenges. Dolores, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Racism and power, as Eli just mentioned a minute ago, they're not going to give up their power. I mean, in our redistricting work that we have done, we have several of our staff, in fact, all of our staff working on redistricting. You know, we have a demographer, we have drawn the maps, we have done everything the right way. We have gathered surveys, we have gathered petitions. We have our members have attended every single meeting that they've had, every public meeting that they have had. In fact, they are objecting. They're even calling our maps where to Mandarin. We have experts and professionals that we are working with, but it doesn't. At least at the county level, it doesn't seem to make a difference. At the school board level, it's all about power. So we know that we're going to probably have to raise money to file lawsuits, because this is what we had to do before. We worked together with MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and also other organizations to challenge and to file lawsuits against these different boards so that we can get fair maps. So what we're doing right now, we might say, might be just the first step. We've done everything that we can in terms of organizing community support. We're going to be having a march in Fresno on December the 4th, a huge march again to bring attention to what, especially at the board of supervisors level, what they're doing in terms of keeping the Latino population from having representation. So we'd like to invite people that want to come and join us. It's going to be you can go to our website, doloreshuerta.org, to get more information. So at our level, we're doing everything that we can to get fair maps. But the people in power, they're going to fight as hard as they can. And so I think all of us have to think about, this is going to be the next step that we're going to have to take. We've had, in fact, the last meeting, the meeting before the last one, the people that were opposing our maps were a lot of the Trumpers, I'm going to call them. They got so rowdy and so loud that the sheriffs had to take some of them out of the meeting. And our group was totally nonviolent and peaceful, rational, and yet, so they are now equating what we want to get fair districts with steal the election. That has been the big lie that the Republican Party and the Trumpers have been promoting. So they're connecting that, which makes our job a lot harder, you might say. They've made it a real political issue, and we have to be aware of that.
Sunny, your take on the challenges facing the Latino community at this moment and how redistricting plays into that?
Yeah, so at the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, we say that every issue is a Latino issue, and redistricting affects everything because it is about who's elected into power, and so who has control over budgets, over resources, over simple things like, will the roads get fixed in your neighborhood because there's someone advocating for you and who cares about your neighborhood? Will there be a new public park open? Will you be able, will the schools get the proper funding? So everything is, all issues matter to Latino people because all issues affect their lives, and redistricting affects every issue because unfortunately money affects every issue. And so where city, school board, county supervisors, and state level resources are being allocated is so dependent on who's in office and who's advocating for your voices. So I would just say that redistricting matters because it's just, again, like what I've said before, redistricting is about political power, and political power is about just being able to have someone speaking, as Dolores said, on your behalf. And no one is going to get rid of, no one wants to get rid of their power. Power has to be taken from people.
Yeah, and Ellie, if you could give us your take on the challenges. I think you might be on mute.
Oh, thank you. And I'll stick a little bit to the representation part, right? So back in 2014, Accord led a coalition of organizations and communities in Anaheim and was able to get the Measure L passed, which amended the city's charter for council members to be elected by districts rather than at-large elections. What this meant is that the Latino community had an opportunity now to have real representation at the city level, the city council level, by electing someone who is indeed from their community and represents their community. And I say this almost in theory because that's what is supposed to happen, but we've seen that this sometimes is still not the case, right? So it was a huge win for the city. And because the city, before that had been heavily ruled by corporate money, right? And if you know Orange County and you know Anaheim, you know who is in the area, right? So fast forward to today, right? The districts are being redrawn. We learned that communities that are in the districts where, for example, Disneyland and the Angel stadiums are, which are majority Latino working class communities, are not fully being represented. Because their community is far different from all the other communities in these surrounding areas. And unfortunately, we know that in election times, many times money can sway an election. And so these communities aren't feeling represented. So for them, this is an opportunity to really challenge the corporate interests, right? And to almost simplify to say, okay, well, who you elect is going to be the difference between if there is going to be more affordable housing that is going to be built in your community or passed in your community, or is it going to be more corporate development that's going to be developed in your community? Like, that's the real things that take place when you elect certain people, when you do not elect people that fully represent your districts, right? And so I think for us is we're seeing that opportunity now, and there are communities that are really fighting right now to actually not be in a district with Disneyland and Angel Stadium, for example. And this is like a real fight that is taking place, right? But for this, we need to continue to organize and advocate. We need to, and despite, right, in the time of being of COVID, right? So it is a challenge because, generally speaking, redistricting is not the most sexiest issue to organize around. And many times it's one of the most complex issue to really understand for communities. So I think, it's a challenge, and we're trying to find a way to make sure that we simplify this process, similar to the way that the census was simplified for the community when we did the 2020 census work, and we were able to really bring it down to the community level. And so I think that is both the challenge, but the importance of why this work is really important at this moment.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point about redistricting. I like to think of it as the middle piece between the census and elections, like that it's sort of the bridge. So speaking of elections, we have the 2022 midterms coming up next year, and a lot of conversation around how redistricting will impact those elections. I was wondering if we could talk about, what that looks like, what impacts you're expecting, and what you might be hoping to see. So Dolores, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off with, what impact does redistricting have on the 2022 elections?
Well, we don't know exactly what the lines are going to look like, as we said before, but I'll give you a really good example. Again, in the Central Valley of California, my congressperson is Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy is, as you know, the leader of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. And he has been one of those that has now refusing to cooperate with the investigation of what happened on January the 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol, right? And so he's a very influential person. And of course, we don't know what his district is going to look like. We'll see when it comes out of this commission. We have another very right-wing Republican in the Central Valley, Devin Nunes. And again, as the census pointed out, that the Latinos we are the majority in the Central Valley of California. And yet we have these 2 congressional districts. In fact, we have 3 congressional districts that are now represented by Republicans. So they do not represent the majority of the people in the Central Valley, which are now Latinos. So we'll see after the redistricting if we are going to be able to elect the first Latino. Our Assemblyperson, Rudy Salas, is running for the Congress right now. If he gets elected, he'll be the first Latino from the Central Valley, which is a majority Latino. And so we can see the impact. And I want to mention one other thing, too. We know that the legislature last year passed a bill that ethnic studies are going to be a mandatory requirement in all of our high schools. Well, in order to be able to erase the massive ignorance, as I call it, that we have in our society right now, to be able to teach students the true history of the United States of America, and I like to say to people, Google a map of the United States before 1848, and you will see a third of the United States was Mexico. People don't know that. Again, the contribution, we opened this beautiful forum by talking about our indigenous Native Americans here and what happened to them in California and throughout the country. People, this is not in our history books. It's got to be in our history books. The contribution of every immigrant group that came to the United States, that's got to be taught so that we can get rid of the hatred and the racism that exists in our society. If we do not have good school board members throughout the state of California, they may or may not make sure that the ethnic studies curriculum is included in our schools. So we're talking about far-reaching consequences. Not only that the districts that are going to be drawn are going to be there for the next 10 years until the next census. So the impact on everybody's lives is so important. The way that these district lines are drawn, because it's going to affect every single person, every single family, every single child, every single student. Again, the money and the support that we're going to be able to get depends on who gets elected.
Thank you. And I did just want to add, we will be fielding questions if anyone has any. So we will try to get to audience questions at the end. But Sunny, if you could talk about impact on 2022 elections, midterm elections.
Yeah, so I think that what we can say right now is that under the currently proposed maps from the Commission on Congressional, State Assembly, and State Senate, we will see, and these are the currently proposed maps, they will obviously change, but as of right now, like we do see and we do know that there'll be somewhat less Latino representation or influence districts. So the Public Policy Institute of California, I have to give them credit, they did a great analysis of Latino representation under the draft maps. And so you will see that on the proposed congressional, proposed state senate, and proposed state assembly, the number of Latino influence districts goes down, but you see the number of Latino majority districts also actually increase under these maps. So it is possible that at the end of the day, we might have more Latino preferred candidates being elected, but the ability of Latinos to influence districts may be less. One other thing that I think is important to note, though, is that under these proposed maps, like the total amount of districts may be less on the proposed congressional map. And I do find it concerning that the growth of California and the story of the growth of California for the past 20 years has been the growth of a vibrant Latino community, as well as a vibrant API community. And so it's just important that we are respecting these communities and acknowledging that it cannot be that Latinos now are the majority of California, but still when elections come around, they're not, being adequately represented.
Ellie, if you could talk about what 2022 looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think about California, many times folks forget that Orange County has been an ongoing battleground over the last few general elections, right? So I think that, and I've heard someone say, as Orange County goes, so goes the rest of the country and Congress, right? And so for us, the way that the congressional lines are going to be drawn is going to give us a huge indicator of what can possibly happen in next year's elections, especially in the seats that are going to be up for grab. And we know that this midterms, can very well switch the power at the House of Representatives side. And so I think that this is going to be a huge implication because, like I said, as Orange County goes, so goes the rest of the country, right? But if I want to bring it down to more of a local level, we've seen districts that are in jeopardy of not being around and or being combined with other districts right now. So this means that candidates who had not considered running against each other may have to do so next year. And I'm talking about like the city level, for example. We are seeing this possibly taking place in the city of Santa Ana and even potentially in the school district race in Santa Ana as well. So that's going to put some electeds and actually Latino electeds possibly up against each other. And so the community will need to decide who better represents their interests. And in the case of the school district, which candidate is going to better represent the interests of their children, right? And so they're going to have to make that choice. So this redistricting process will determine the makeup of the districts and political priorities that take place next, right? Because it's not just about getting somebody elected, but it's about what happens after that and what type of governance comes with that elected official, with that candidate who gets elected, right? So in Anaheim, for example, where corporate priorities win or where community priorities win. This is a real fight that is going to take place after this redistricting process. So this will impact the city of Anaheim, but it will impact the entire county. We know that the city of Anaheim is hub to many corporate events and companies. And so I think Anaheim is also one of those cities that we're going to be paying very close attention to and seeing what happens eventually with the drawings of the lines there. And then we're going to figure out which interests are going to come out on top in the end in 2022.
Yeah, and you mentioned Orange County. I think it's interesting. What we see in specific areas is often representative of the trends that are going on, around the state. So we've talked a lot about why redistricting matters and what impacts it has. I wanted to switch gears to what our audience can do to be part of this process, how to participate, how to make sure that their voices are heard. So Dolores, if you wouldn't mind talking about that.
The hearings are happening right now as we speak. They're going on, and people can get on their websites and look it up. The Board of Supervisors hearings are being held. The school districts are having their hearings. So it's really, really important that we show up to those hearings and look at those maps. And again, we can connect with the different organizations that are working on redistricting so that we can support the fair maps that are being drawn. And speak up in opposition to maps that we see that are not fair. And it's not all that complicated, because when we look at a map, we can look at the neighborhoods that are in those different maps that are being drawn. And so we can speak up and make have our comments heard. And even like in our area, where we know that the Board of Supervisors here, they already voted to accept their map. And the same thing happened in Fresno. But the fact that they're making the comments, that makes it a lot easier when we have to go forward with lawsuits to make them redraw the maps if they are not a fair representation of the community. I also want to add one other thing to Eli Flores' statement, is we also, when we think about elections, we're trying to get progressive people elected. We have some, for instance, Democrats that we might call corporate Democrats, that even though they're Democrats, they vote as if they were Republicans. And when we have such important issues, such as climate change, global warming, and that people are going to be having to vote on, and this is not going to happen if we get corporate Democrats that are elected as against progressive Democrats that are elected, that are not going to be with us on the important issues of police conduct reform, making our education more equitable for our children of color, global warming. These are the big issues that are coming up here. Again, support for women's issues, feminist issues. So we also have to be careful that we're supporting progressive Democrats and not the corporate Democrats, because unfortunately, those corporate Democrats can hold up major pieces of legislation, as they have been doing in the Congress right now with the Build Back Better Act. You have they're Democrats, and guess where they're from? The Central Valley of California.
Thank you. And Sunny, if you could talk about what people can do to be involved in the process.
Yeah, so I would say that, I think it's going, and as Dolores said, going and speaking and making comments is extraordinarily important. It's important because you should want to have your voice heard, but then also it makes it easier for advocates if bad maps are adopted to be able to challenge those maps as ones that were not part of the community, but then also to be able to reconstruct what we call remedial or remedy maps, and urge a court to adopt a map that is reflective of what people want. I would also say that one really important thing is that if you live in a diverse community, every single jurisdiction that redistricts in the United States is required to comply with the US Constitution and with federal law. And what that means is they have to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. So asking a county commission, the county supervisors, your city, your school board, they all have to comply with federal law. And what that means is that they also have to be doing analysis to make sure that their districts comply with that federal law. And so I would go on the record and say, have you done a Voting Rights Act analysis? The public would like to see one. If you can make that public. Again, also, the Fair Maps Act is now in effect, which applies to county supervisors and I believe cities as well. And so making sure that the districts that are being drawn are not partisan gerrymandered, that's something that voters can talk about and just ask for. Just asking for these analysis is really important. You don't have to be the person that does it. They have people who are hired. They have lawyers who know how to do this. Every single jurisdiction, every school board and city council and county supervisors, they all have people who do this type of analysis. They hire them when they're drawing maps. So I would really advocate for that. Just these are simple questions. It also, bring some daylight into the process. Like, what are they doing? How are they drawing maps? What are the criteria that they're drawing maps on? And again, just speaking, even if it's writing, I would also say writing emails. If you don't want to go and speak, write an email, put a public comment. Anything that you can do publicly is very helpful. And I know that it can be extraordinarily intimidating to go speak in public. In some areas, it may be unsafe. You feel unsafe to speak in public. So sending emails and other public comment that's virtual is also something that people can do.
Thank you. And Ellie, if you could talk about how people can participate in the process.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to talk about what Sunny talked about. So I'll just add, because she's totally right. There is, you don't have to be an expert in mapping. You don't have to be an expert in redistricting law and policy and all that. You could simply ask the question, what are you doing to engage Latinos in this process? Especially if your city or your county it has a big Latino population. You could also ask the question, what are you doing to make it language accessible? What are you doing to make sure that folks who do not speak English can also have access to this information and to be part of this process, right? Asking these questions is going to push the city and the county to become more transparent and have to show more of what they're doing, right? We've seen that some cities like to speed, and even counties like to speed the process through, right? And so, but what that does is that it really hurts participation and community involvement in the process. And so I think asking questions, simple questions, how are you engaging Latinos? Show us how you're engaging them. How many have been engaged? Right? Asking those questions is going to push folks to become more transparent, and you're going to get that information out there. And once you find out and you can see whether Latinos are being truly engaged or not, I think then you got an opportunity there, to be able to advocate and organize around some of those issues. And then I would say, there's existing organizations and groups that are already doing this work. So for example, in Orange County, we have a Public Redistricting Alliance, which is a coalition of organizations that have come together to push for districts that are representative of the Voting Rights Act, of Latino districts and all that. And so, there's ways to plug into these existing groups. I know LA County has an existing group, an alliance as well. I'm sure Central Valley and other groups. So I think there's ways to connect to local organizations and coalitions that are already doing this work certainly Accord is one of those places that you can reach out to. You can find us through social media at Accord, or you can just email us at info@accord.org. And, we'll be more than happy to plug you into any of the work. The more people that show up to these meetings, to these public hearings, the better, the more impact we're going to have and influence we're going to have on these maps. So more people to show up, more people to call in. Totally agree with Sunny. Send in an email, right? It could be a simple 2 lines, ask a question, say something, right? All of this really, really matters, especially because it goes on public record. And so as Dolores Huerta had shared earlier, if this needs to go to litigation, there is backup information that we can go to and said, the community said X, Y, and Z. We did have people bring this up to you. We did try to push for that early on, and you did not do your job. And then so all of this really helps in the case that we need to go into litigation after these maps have been drawn.
Yeah, thank you. That was all very informative. And we do have some questions from the audience that actually tie right into that that question. They're both about timing. So the first question, it feels like some local commissions are rushing through the process and, maybe using COVID-19 as an excuse to just get it done. So what are ways to advocate? So I think you guys talked about some good ways, asking questions, asking for analyses. Is there anything else that you might suggest for slowing down this process when it's being rushed? And feel free to jump in if anybody has anything. Dolores, you might be muted.
I would say that. Oh.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, me?
Go ahead, Sunny.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, I would just say that the process can seem kind of rushed at the moment because the census data was late. Normally, in a redistricting year, the census data would come out in March, the latest April, and so there would be time from April until the end of the year in December for local jurisdictions and for the state to be able to redistrict. This year, because of the delays in the census, due to COVID-19, but also due to a lot of the previous administration's attempts to, I would say, sabotage an accurate count of the census, everyone was put behind. So now what's really happening is that a lot of redistricting didn't start until April or September. I will say that I do think that commissions used COVID, or Board of Supervisors, counties, cities, everyone who redistricts did use COVID-19 as an excuse because they could have been doing public hearings for months beforehand to be able to get people's feedback and draw accurate maps. A lot of the meetings that happened in earlier this year in September and October, maps were not even formally introduced yet. So I do think it's both. Like, we do have to acknowledge the limitations of jurisdictions because of the late release of the census data, but we also have to say that redistricting could have happened earlier on, or at least started earlier on, because again, we could have had community feedback a lot earlier. I would also say, and what's important to note is that public meetings should be held in California with not just translators, but there should, in areas that have large communities that speak Spanish, should hold meetings in Spanish only. One thing is that the entire state of California is covered under for language access under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. And while that may not apply to redistricting directly, it should be a cue that redistricting is part of elections. And so I just really want to say that you can advocate for that. First, you should advocate for meetings that are primarily held in Spanish with English translators.
And Dolores, I think you wanted to chime in on that question as well.
Well, just that, again, thank you very much for saying that we have to really, send in those emails and even telephone calls. If you look up on the local Board of Supervisors meeting is happening, or the local school board meeting, and you can call in and just make sure that your comment and your name, they will have a time for public comment so that you can just call in and say whether you support a map or not. And as you mentioned also, we have all these different coalitions, mapping coalitions, and people can come to our website, doloreshuerta.org, and they could get information there about which coalition they want to get information from. But I think the main thing is a lot of people don't understand that this is important. They know that voting is important, and they don't realize that this correlation between the maps, the districts that are drawn is going to determine and how effective our votes are going to be. And so it's important, I think, that we try to get the word out to people and let them know and encourage them to participate in the process. And then the other thing is, don't forget about these other utility districts. I mentioned some of the water districts. Some people think, wow, I didn't even know we had that utility, that water district in our area. Yes, and those elections are also very important, like the school board election. So I know it's a lot for people to digest, and we're kind of like at the end of the whole process right now. But if we can encourage people to come and to participate and make them understand this mapping is as important as voting, because it's all combined, it's all together.
Thank you, Christian. I think you might be on mute.
I might be muted. Okay, there you go. Well, thank you so much, Samia and Sunny and Dolores and Ellie, for such a phenomenal conversation. I was actually taking notes this entire time. I think too often when we think about redistricting, we automatically jump right to what happens at the federal level in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And while that's super important, right, it's also like these local school boards, the water boards that you mentioned, Dolores,
Mm-hmm.
These boards of supervisors in places like Fresno, Orange County. It also happens in places like San Mateo County. It happens all over the state. So I think if there's a call to action for everybody that is watching right now, it's that now is the time to participate. I think tonight, the We Draw the Lines Commission is actually taking public testimony from people. So tonight would actually be a good start to let them know about your community and how you want to be represented. And I would also encourage you to tap in locally, right, to see how things are going at all levels of government, from school board, water board, city council to county, because all of this really does matter. So I just want to thank Cal Matters for being such a phenomenal partner. Thank you to UCLA, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, Accord. I think it's important to also underscore that this is a nonpartisan civic engagement tool. I think no matter your politics, I think we can all agree upon that if our democracy is to be strong, it is to be fair, right? And as a growing Latino population, like, we need to make sure that we are represented in processes like this. So with that, I want to thank everybody, and we're gonna kick it off to a short video from the Latino Community Foundation. So thank you all for joining today, and have a good rest of the day.
Hey, California. Our state is undergoing an important process right now called redistricting. Once every decade, California must redraw the lines that make up local, state, and national representative districts. And it's up to us to make sure these lines are drawn fairly and accurately. We must ensure that our neighborhoods and communities are kept together. Our political representation depends on it, because deciding who represents our communities in Congress and the California legislature is at stake. Latinos make up 39% of California's population, one of the largest communities of interest in our state. Our voices will shape the future of California. Learn more today by visiting latinocf.org/redistricting. This message is brought to you by the Latino Community Foundation.